Section 6 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 2. How the psychological characteristics of races are displayed in the various elements of their civilizations. Chapter 1. The various elements of civilization considered as an exterior manifestation of the soul of the people. The elements of which a civilization is composed are the exterior manifestations of the soul of the peoples which have created them. The importance of these various elements varies with the different peoples. According to the several peoples, it is the arts, literature, institutions, etc. that fill the fundamental role. Examples from antiquity: the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. The evolution of the different elements of a civilization may be independent of the general march of that civilization. Examples supplied by the arts: what they express, impossibility of finding in a single element of a civilization the measure of the level of that civilization, elements which assure the superiority of a people, elements which philosophically are very inferior may be socially very superior. The different elements, languages, institutions, ideas, beliefs, arts, literature, of which a civilization is composed, should be regarded as the exterior manifestation of the soul of the men who have created them. The importance, however, of these elements as the expression of the soul of a people varies greatly with the period and the races. Few books relating to works of art appear at the present day that do not contain the statement that works of art are the faithful rendering of the thought of peoples and the most important expression of their civilization. Doubtless it is often true that this is the case, but the rule is a long way from being absolute, and the development of the arts is far from corresponding invariably to the intellectual development of nations. While there are certain peoples for whom works of art are the most important manifestation of their soul, there are others who occupy moreover a high rank in the scale of civilization, among whom the arts have played but a very secondary part. If the history of the civilization of each people had to be written on the understanding that only one of its elements was to be considered, the element chosen ought to vary in the case of each people. For some peoples the element would be the arts, but for others it would be their institutions, their military organization, their industry, their commerce, etc., that would give the best knowledge of them. It is important to establish this point at the outset, for it will enable us later to understand how it is that the various elements of a civilization have undergone very unequal transformations when transmitted from one people to another. Among the peoples of antiquity, the Egyptians and Romans offer highly characteristic examples of this inequality in the development of the various elements of a civilization, and even in the various branches of which each of these elements is composed. Let us begin by considering the Egyptians. Their literature was always very weak, their painting of very poor quality. In architecture and statuary, on the contrary, they produced masterpieces. Their monuments will excite our admiration. The Egyptian statues that have come down to us, the scribe, the Sheikh al-Beled, Rahotep, Nefertari, and many others, would still be models at the present day, and it was only during a very short period that they were surpassed by the Greeks. With the Egyptians let us compare the Romans, whose role in history was so preponderating. They lacked neither educators nor models, since they came after the Egyptians and Greeks, and yet they did not succeed in creating a personal art. No people, perhaps, has ever displayed less originality in its artistic productions. The Romans held the arts in very slight esteem, scarcely regarding them from other than a utilitarian point of view, and looking on them merely as a sort of imported article, analogous to the other products, such as metals, aromatics, and spices, for which they were indebted to foreign peoples. At the period when they were already masters of the world, the Romans had no national art, and even later on, when universal peace, wealth, and the needs of luxury somewhat developed their weak artistic sentiments, it was always to Greece that they went for models and artists. The history of Roman architecture and sculpture is scarcely more than an appendix to the history of the sculpture and architecture of Greece. On the other hand, this great Roman people, which was so inferior in the arts, developed three other elements of civilization to the highest pitch. It possessed military institutions, which ensured it the empire of the world, political and juridical institutions which still serve us as models, and finally it created a literature which for centuries has been the source of inspiration of our own. We thus have a striking example of the unequal development of the elements of the civilization in the case of two nations whose high degree of culture cannot be contested, and we can divine the errors that would result from taking as sole standard but one of these elements, the arts for example. We have just found that among the Egyptians the arts, with the exception of painting, were extremely original and remarkable, while literature, on the contrary, did not rise above mediocrity. Among the Romans the arts were mediocre and without a trace of originality, but they shone in the field of literature, and their military and political institutions were of the highest order. The Greeks themselves, though one of the peoples that has displayed the most superiority in the most different fields, may also be cited in proof of the unequal way in which the development of the various elements of the civilization proceeds. At the Homeric epoch their literature was already very brilliant, since the songs of Homer are still regarded as the models with which the students of the European universities are condemned to saturate themselves, a view that has been taken for centuries past. But the discoveries of modern archaeology have proved that, at the period to which the Homeric songs belong, Greek sculpture and architecture were grossly barbarian and confined to crude imitations of Egyptian and Assyrian art. However, it is more especially the Hindus that furnish us with an example of the unequal development of the different elements of a civilization. As regards architecture, they have been surpassed by very few peoples. As regards philosophy, the depth of their speculations has only been attained to by European thought at a quite recent date. In literature, if they do not reach the level of the Greeks and Latins, they have nevertheless produced admirable work. Their statuary, on the contrary, is mediocre, and much below that of the Greeks. In the domain of science and in that of historical knowledge they have absolutely nothing to show, and they exhibit an absence of precision that is not met with to an equal degree in any other people. Their sciences have been mere childish speculations, their histories absurd legends, containing not a single exact date and probably not a single exact event. In their case, once again, the exclusive study of the arts would be insufficient to determine the level of their civilization. Many other examples might be adduced in support of what precedes. There are races which, although they have never occupied an absolutely superior rank, have succeeded in creating an absolutely personal art bearing no visible relation to anterior models. The Arabs are a case in point. Less than a century after they had invaded the old Greco-Roman world, they had so utterly transformed the Byzantine architecture they had begun by adopting, that it would be impossible to determine the types that had inspired them, if it were not that we are still able to consult the series of intermediary monuments. Moreover, even if a people should not possess any artistic or literary aptitude, it is capable of creating a civilization of a superior order. This happened in the case of the Phoenicians, whose sole superiority was their skill in commerce. It was they who civilized the ancient world by bringing all its parts into communication. But as far as they themselves were concerned, they produced scarcely anything, and the history of their civilization is the history of their commerce. Finally, there are peoples among whom all the elements of civilization have remained in an inferior state, with the exception of the arts. The Mongolians were a people of this kind. The monuments they raised in India, in a style about which there is scarcely anything Hindu, are so magnificent that competent artists declare that some of them rank among the most beautiful monuments that have been raised by the hand of man, and yet nobody could think of classing the Mongols among the superior races. It will be noticed, moreover, that even among the most civilized peoples, it is not always at the culminating period of their civilization that the arts attain to the highest degree of development. Among the Egyptians and among the Hindus the most perfect monuments are generally the most ancient, while in Europe it was in the Middle Ages, an epoch regarded as semi-barbarian, that flourished that marvellous Gothic art whose admirable productions have never been equalled. In consequence, it is quite impossible to judge of the level of a people solely by the development of its arts, which constitute, I repeat, but one of the elements of its civilization, and an element whose superiority is not proven, any more than the superiority of literature is proven. It often happens, on the contrary, that it is among the peoples at the head of civilization, the Romans for instance, in ancient times, and the Americans at the present day, that artistic productions show the most weakness. Frequently, too, as we just remarked, it has been in semi-barbarous ages that the peoples have produced their literary and artistic masterpieces, their artistic masterpieces more especially. It would even seem that the period of personality in the arts, in the case of a people, is a growth belonging to its childhood or its youth, and not to its maturity. And if it be considered that among the utilitarian preoccupations of the new world of which we catch a glimpse of the dawn, the role of the arts is scarcely observable, we may foresee the day when they will be classed, if not among the inferior, at least among the quite secondary manifestations of a civilization. There are many reasons why the progress of the arts in their evolution should not be parallel to that of the other elements of a civilization, and should not in consequence be always a sure indication of the state of this civilization. Whether in the case of Egypt, of Greece, or of the various European peoples, we observe this general law that as soon as art has reached a certain level, as soon that it is as certain masterpieces have been produced, there immediately commences a period of decadence entirely independent of the movement of the other elements of the civilization. This decadent phase of the arts subsists until a political revolution, an invasion, the adoption of new beliefs, or any other factor introduces new elements into art. It was in this way that in the Middle Ages the Crusades were the source of fresh knowledge and new ideas which gave an impulsion to art that resulted in the transformation of the Roman style into the Gothic style. It was in this way again that several centuries later the revival of Greek and Latin studies brought about the transformation of Gothic art into the art of the Renaissance. In India too, the Mussulman invasions caused the transformation of Hindu art in precisely the same fashion. It is also of importance to observe that since the arts express in general fashion certain of the needs of civilization and correspond to certain sentiments, they are fated to undergo transformations in conformity with these needs, and even to disappear entirely if the needs and the sentiments which have given birth to them should themselves be transformed or disappear. It will in no wise follow, however, that the civilization is on this account in decadence. And here once more we are confronted with the absence of parallelism between the evolution of the arts and that of the other elements of a civilization. At no period in history has civilization been at so high a pitch as at the present day, and at no period perhaps has art been more commonplace and less personal. The religious beliefs, the ideas, and the needs which made art an essential element of civilization at the periods when it had temples and palaces for its sanctuaries having disappeared, art has become an accessory, an instrument of pleasure to which it is not possible to devote either much time or much money. Being no longer a necessity, it can scarcely escape being artificial and imitative. At the present day there are no longer peoples who possess a national art, and each people, in architecture as in sculpture, lives on more or less happy copies of the work of bygone epochs. These modest copies doubtless represent needs or caprices, but it is clear that it is impossible that they should express our modern ideas. I admire the naive works of our artists of the Middle Ages as seen in their paintings of saints, of Christ, of paradise and hell, all of which were of fundamental importance at the time and the principal concern of existence. But when painters who no longer entertain these beliefs cover our walls with primitive legends or childish symbols in an attempt to return to the technique of another age, they merely produce wretched imitations without interest for the present and destined to arouse contempt in the future. The only real arts, the only arts which are the expression of an epoch, are those in which the artist represents what he feels or what he sees instead of confining himself to the imitation of forms corresponding to needs or beliefs we have ceased to possess. The only sincere painting of the present day is that which reproduces the things by which we are surrounded, just as the only sincere architecture is that of the 5-storied house, the viaduct, and the railway station. This utilitarian art corresponds to the needs and ideas of our civilization. It is as characteristic of the epoch as were formerly the Gothic church and the feudal castle. For the archaeologist of the future, the great modern caravanserais and the old Gothic churches will be of equal interest, because they will be successive pages in those books of stone which each century leaves behind, while he will disdain as useless documents the sorry counterfeit copies of so many modern artists. Every aesthetic system represents the ideal of an epoch and of a race, and for the sole reason that epochs and races are different, the ideal must constantly be varying. From the philosophic point of view, all ideals are of equal worth, for they constitute more transitory symbols. The arts, then, like all the elements of civilization, are the exterior manifestation of the soul of the people that has created them. But we ought to recognize, however, that they are far from constituting, in the case of all peoples, the most exact manifestation of their thought. This demonstration was necessary, for the importance in the case of a given people of a given element of civilization is a measure of the power of transformation which that people brings to bear on the element in question when it borrows it from a foreign race. If its personality displays itself more especially in the arts, for example, its reproductions of imported models are sure to be deeply marked by its own imprint. On the contrary, it will transform but very slightly the elements that are incapable of serving to interpret its genius. When the Romans adopted the architecture of Greece, they did not make it the object of radical modifications, because they did not put what was most characteristic of their soul into their monuments. Still, even in the case of such a people as the Romans, who were without a personal architecture, and who were constrained to go to the foreigner for their models and their artists, art is obliged in the course of but few centuries to undergo the influence of environment and to become, almost in spite of itself, the expression of the race that has adopted it. The temples, palaces, triumphal arches, and bas-reliefs of ancient Rome are the work of Greeks or of pupils of the Greeks, and yet the character of these monuments, their destination, their ornaments, even their dimensions, do not arouse in us the delicate, poetic memories of the Athenian genius, but rather the ideas of force, of domination, and of military passion with which the mighty soul of Rome was imbued. Thus, even in the field in which it shows itself least personal, a race can accomplish nothing that does not bear some trace of the fact that it was due to its initiative, and without revealing something of its mental constitution and innermost thought. The explanation is that the true artist, whether architect or poet, possesses the magic faculty of expressing in his synthesis the soul of an epoch and of a race, very impressionable, very unconscious. Thinking more especially in images and reasoning but little, artists are at certain epochs the faithful mirrors of the society in which they live. Their works are the most exact documents to which recourse can be had with a view to evoking a vanished civilization. They are too unconscious not to be sincere, and too impressed by their surroundings not to give faithful expression to the ideas, sentiments, needs, and tendencies of their environment. They are not free to create what they choose, and the fact constitutes their strength. They are imprisoned in a network of traditions, ideas, and beliefs, the sum total of which constitutes the soul of a race and an epoch, the inheritance of sentiments, thoughts, and inspirations whose influence is all-powerful over them because it governs the obscure regions of the unconscious in which their works are elaborated. Were we without these works, and did we know nothing of the vanished centuries but what is related of them in the absurd narratives and artificial arrangements of the books of history, the real past of each people would be almost as great an enigma to us as that of the mysterious Atlantiades, submerged, according to Plato, by the waters. The essential characteristic, then, of the work of art is to be the sincere expression of the needs and ideas of the age that gives it birth. Of all the various languages which relate the story of the past, works of art, those of architecture in particular, are the most intelligible. More sincere than books, less artificial than religions and languages, they express both the sentiments and the needs of their period. The architect builds the dwelling places of men and those of the gods, and it was always within the precincts of the temple or those of the house that were elaborated the first causes of the events which constitute history. We may conclude from what precedes that while the various elements of which a civilization is composed are indeed the expression of the soul of the people that has created them, certain of these elements, though which of them varies with the races and also with the epochs in the case of the same race, are a more exact expression of the soul of a race than others. Since, however, the nature of these elements varies with the different peoples and the different epochs, it is evident that it is impossible to find a single element capable of serving as a common standard, whereby to gauge the level of the different civilizations. It is also evident that a hierarchical classification cannot be established among these elements, for the classification would vary from century to century, the importance of the elements considered varying itself with the periods. If the value of the diverse elements of a civilization were to be judged solely from the point of view of pure utility, it might be affirmed that the most important elements of a civilization are those which allow one people to subject another, that is to say, military institutions. But if this test were adopted, it would be necessary to rank the Greeks, a nation of artists, philosophers, and writers, after the Romans with their invincible cohorts, the virtuous and learned Egyptians, after the semi-barbarian Persians, and the Hindus after the Mongols, who were also semi-barbarians. History is but little concerned with these subtle distinctions. The only superiority before which it always bows is military superiority, which is very rarely accompanied by a corresponding superiority in the other elements of civilization, or at least does not long allow the maintenance of its side of this latter superiority. Unfortunately, military superiority cannot decline among a people without that people being fated to disappear. It has always been when they had reached the apogee of civilization that the superior peoples have had to retire before barbarians, much their inferiors as regards intelligence, but possessing certain qualities of character and warlike aptitudes to which too refined civilizations have always been fatal. It is necessary in consequence to arrive at the saddening conclusion that it is the elements which, philosophically speaking, are inferior that are the most important from the social point of view. If the laws of the future are to be those of the past, it may be said that to have attained to too high a degree of intelligence and culture is what is most harmful to a people. Peoples perish as soon as the qualities of character which form the groundwork of their soul begin to decline, and these qualities decline as soon as the civilization and intelligence of a people reach a high level. End of section 6.